Okay, so, we always ask you to send us stuff that's got you thinking, and wow, did you guys deliver on this one?
Yeah, this is
This blog post from the Observer Hub is intense.
it really is. It's got a lot to unpack for sure.
Definitely.
Hmm.
So Nnamdi Kanu's legal battles, they've been going on for a while now, and this post from the Observer Hub, it tries to sort of untangle it all, right? It goes into his leadership with IPOB, the indigenous people of Biafra, and that whole movement for an independent Biafra.
And the history too, like they go back and give you some background, which is really helpful, I think.
Totally. And we also get to hear directly from Kanu himself through this open letter that he wrote, which the Observer Hub includes. Like, it's a pretty powerful read.
Absolutely. There's a lot of emotion in there, a lot of anger and frustration.
For sure. So what we're going to do today is try to break all of this down for you, right?
Yeah.
Because it can get complicated quickly. There's a lot of legal stuff, a lot of history, and a lot of very strong opinions on both sides.
And we're not here to take sides or anything like that, right? We're just here to look at the information that the Observer Hub has presented and try to, make sense of it all.
Exactly. So before we dive into the specifics, what really struck me reading this Observer Hub piece was this, central tension that they highlight right away. Like, you have Kanu's supporters who see him as this, almost like a folk hero, this brave guy fighting for what he believes in.
Right.
And then you have the Nigerian government who view him as a very real threat to national security.
It's such a stark contrast, right? Like those two sides couldn't be further apart in how they view him.
Yeah, and that, I think, is what makes this whole story so fascinating. It's not just a legal case. It's about these really fundamental questions about, freedom and self-determination and the use of state power.
Absolutely. And the Observer Hub, I think they do a really good job of weaving all those threads together. They start by really introducing us to Nnamdi Kanu and the movement he leads, right? So we get a sense of who he is, what IPOB stands for, their goals.
And right away, the Observer Hub, they bring up this question of legality, right? Like, is IPOB actually an illegal group or not?
Yeah. And that's huge, right? Because the whole basis for the government's charges against Kanu rests on whether IPOB is seen as a legitimate organization or a terrorist group.
Right, because the charges are serious.
Yeah.
We're talking terrorism, treason.
Yeah.
It's not messing around.
And Kanu's lawyers, they're fighting back hard on that front. They're saying, look, these charges are politically motivated. They're trying to silence him.
And on top of that, they're challenging how he was even brought to Nigeria in the first place.
Right.
This whole thing about his extraordinary rendition from Kenya.
Right. They're saying that was illegal. So everything that's happened since then, the trial, the charge, it's all tainted.
It's like the whole foundation of the case is shaky from the get-go.
Yeah. And the Observer Hub, they point to this 2017 ruling by a federal high court that said pretty clearly IPOB is not an unlawful group.
Yeah. But then Kanu's argument is that the government basically ignored that ruling and went ahead and labeled IPOB as terrorists anyway.
Through this ex parte proceeding, which basically means they went to the court without IPOB even being present to defend themselves.
Which seems,
Right.
kind of shady.
Right. Like, how can you declare a group a terrorist organization without even giving them a chance to respond?
And Kaidu specifically claims that this was done using a letter from the late Abakari. Like, the former attorney general pushed for this to happen, and Kyari signed off on it.
And that really raises questions about the whole separation of powers, right? Like, is the executive branch overstepping its bounds and interfering with the judiciary?
And then there's this whole other layer to all this, which is pretty disturbing, to be honest.
Yeah.
The Observer Hub talks about this incident in September 2017, Operation Python Dance 2.
Yeah, where the army basically raided Kanu's home.
Yeah, and there were reports of casualties.
Yeah.
People killed during this raid.
And that obviously just fueled the anger and the distrust between IPOB supporters and the government. Like, it was a very clear show of force.
Totally.
Yeah.
So it's already a really complex situation, but then you throw in the fact that Nnamdi Kanu is also a British citizen.
Right?
Which brings the UK government into the picture.
Yeah, and the Observer Hub points out that the UK, they're in a tricky spot, right? They want to make sure Kanu is treated fairly, that his rights are respected, but they also need to maintain good relations with Nigeria.
Right. It's a diplomatic tightrope walk, for sure.
And the Observer Hub, they even bring up this legal precedent from the UK. The case of R. Oku Kanu v. Secretary of State for Foreign, Commonwealth, and Development Affairs. It basically sets limits on how far the UK government is actually obligated to go in cases like this.
So basically they can't just, barge in and demand Kanu's release, even if they think he's being treated unfairly.
Right. They have to work within the existing framework of international law and diplomatic channels.
Which I guess makes sense on some level.
Yeah.
But it also feels kind of frustrating, right? Like, if your citizen is being held in another country and you believe they're not getting a fair shake, Shouldn't you be able to do more?
Yeah. I mean, it's definitely a tough situation.
And then to add another layer of complexity, and this is where the historical context gets really interesting, the Observer Hub, they bring up this case of Omaro Diko.
Right, from back in 1984.
Right, so just to kind of recap that for people who might not be familiar with it. Omaro Diko was a Nigerian minister who had gone into exile in London.
Right. He had fallen out of favor with the government.
And then one day he was found drugged and stuffed into a crate at Stansted Airport.
He was like something out of a spy movie.
Right, it was this crazy kidnapping attempt, and it was widely believed to be orchestrated by agents of the Nigerian government.
It caused a huge diplomatic row between the UK and Nigeria.
Yeah, and the Observer Hub, they draw this really clear parallel between Diko's case and what happened with Nnamdi Kanu.
Right, because in both cases, you have these allegations of kidnapping or extraordinary rendition from another country.
And it really highlights how messy these situations can get when you have governments trying to exert their power across borders.
Yeah, and it shows that these kinds of incidents, they're not new, right? This has been going on for decades.
Right. So now let's shift gears a bit and talk about Nnamdi Kanu's open letter, which he wrote in February 2025.
Okay.
So the Observer Hub, they frame this letter as a really direct challenge to the government's narrative about his case.
Right. He's basically saying they've been lying about him and manipulating the legal system to keep him locked up.
And he calls it judicial fraud, which is a pretty strong accusation.
Yeah, he's not holding back. He's really laying out his grievances.
So let's break down some of the key points in the letter that the Observer Hub highlights. First, he doubles down on that 2017 ruling that we talked about earlier, right? One that said IPOB is not an unlawful group.
Right. He keeps coming back to that because to him, it's proof that the government is acting illegally by labeling them as terrorists.
Exactly. And then he brings up that October 2022 ruling from the Federal High Court, the one that declared his rendition unconstitutional.
Right. And he's saying, look, the court even ordered an apology and compensation from the government. But I'm still in prison.
Which, yeah, it does seem kind of illogical.
Right. If they admitted they brought him to Nigeria illegally, why is he still being held?
And then there's the Court of Appeals decision, also from October 2022. They called out the government for what they called executive lawlessness.
Yeah, they were pretty clear that his rendition was illegal. And they even said that the lower court didn't have jurisdiction to hear his case.
But the government still refused to release him.
Mm-hmm.
And Kanu alleges that they pulled some strings to get a stay of execution on that judgment.
Right, like they're stalling for time, trying to find a way to keep him behind bars.
Then we get to the Supreme Court's involvement in December 2023. Now, they did send the case back to the Federal High Court.
Right.
But they also specifically ruled that the initial revocation of Kanu's bail was improper because of judicial bias.
So you'd think that would mean he'd be granted bail again.
But that didn't happen. And Kanu argues that this is another example of the lower court ignoring the Supreme Court's ruling.
Right, like they're just refusing to follow the law.
And then there's this whole thing with the recusal request from September 2024.
Yeah.
So Kanu asks the judge to step down from his case because he believes the judge is biased.
Right.
And the judge actually agrees to recuse himself. But then Kanu alleges that the chief judge of the Federal High Court reassigns the case back to that same judge.
Which is wild, right? Like, what's the point of recusing yourself if you're just going to get assigned the case again?
Right. It makes you wonder if there's something else going on behind the scenes.
Yeah, like is there pressure from higher up to make sure this case goes a certain way?
So after laying out all of these accusations, the Observer Hub, they take a step back and they're like, okay, let's look at the big picture here. They point out that Kanu is making some really serious claims.
Mm-hmm.
He's accusing the government of contempt for the judiciary, questioning the impartiality of the courts, alleging executive overreach and interference, and ultimately arguing that he's being denied justice.
And those are huge questions, right? They go to the heart of how a democracy is supposed to function.
And the Observer Hub, they pose some really important questions for us to consider. Like, is Nigeria's judiciary truly impartial in this case?
Right.
Have Kanu's human rights been violated? What does all this mean for the Biafran independence movement? Why is the government seemingly ignoring court orders that go in Kanu's favor? What are the implications for Nigeria's democracy as a whole? And how does this all connect to the history of discrimination against the Igbo people?
It's like this one case is a microcosm of all these bigger issues that Nigeria is grappling with.
Exactly. And then they bring up this really interesting comparison. They talk about how other figures like Oloye Sunday Adaimo, also known as Sunday Igboho, and Sheikh Ibrahim Zakzaki have both been released by the Nigerian government. But Kanu is still behind bars. And the Observer Hub, they don't say it outright, but they kind of imply that maybe there's some unequal treatment going on here.
Right. Like, is Kanu being treated differently because of his ethnicity or his political beliefs?
Exactly. And that really feeds into this perception that the Igbo people are being marginalized and discriminated against in Nigeria.
Which, sadly has historical roots, right? You
Yeah.
can't talk about this without acknowledging the Biafran War and the trauma that it caused.
Absolutely. So moving on to the latest developments in the case. The Observer Hub reports that Justice John Soho, the Chief Judge of the Federal High Court, has now been appointed to preside over Kanu's case.
Right after the previous judge recused himself.
Exactly. So this is a pretty big deal. It suggests that the judiciary is taking this case very seriously.
But the Observer Hub, they're cautiously optimistic about this development. They say it's important, but it's not a guarantee that things will be different.
Right. Like, we still need to see if this leads to a genuinely fair and transparent legal process.
And ultimately, whether Kanu's rights are actually protected.
And then in a final section called Food for Thought, the Observer Hub, they delve into Nnamdi Kanu's zoological republic analogy for Nigeria.
Right. That's become his sort of signature phrase.
Yeah. And they explain that Kanu actually used to be a proponent of a united Nigeria, but he became increasingly disillusioned with what he saw as the country's dysfunction and corruption.
And he felt like the Igbo people were being treated unfairly.
So he started using this term zoological republic to describe Nigeria.
Which is obviously very provocative.
Right. It suggests that Nigeria is lawless and chaotic, that there's no real respect for human dignity.
And it also carries this connotation of dehumanization, right? Like people are being treated like animals.
Yeah, and Kanu, he sees this as a form of internal neocolonialism.
Right, like the same power structures that existed during colonial times are still in place, just with different faces.
And he believes that the only way to fix this is to break Nigeria apart and allow different regions to govern themselves.
Through a plebiscite where people can vote on whether they want to stay in Nigeria or not.
And in the Observer Hub, they point out that this term zoological republic, it's become really divisive in Nigeria.
Yeah. Some people find it deeply offensive. Others think it's an accurate reflection of reality. And some even think it's not strong enough.
Right. Like it's become a kind of litmus test for how people view the state of the nation.
And the Observer Hub, they leave us with this really powerful question. Will the Nigerian state's actions in handling Kanu's case ultimately validate his critique?
Right. Like, are they going to prove him right by continuing to treat him unfairly?
And I think that's a question that we all need to be asking ourselves as we watch this case unfold.
Absolutely. So to kind of sum up this deep dive into Nnamdi Kanu's legal battles, we've covered a lot of ground.
We have.
We've looked at the specific charges against him, the arguments from both sides, the historical context, the involvement of the UK government, the allegations of judicial bias and executive interference, and the really big questions about justice, human rights, and the rule of law in Nigeria.
And I think what's so important about this case, as the Observer Hub highlights, is that it's not just about one man. It's about these really fundamental issues that are relevant not just to Nigeria, but to countries all over the world.
Right. We're talking about self-determination, the relationship between citizens and the state, the limits of government power, the importance of a fair and impartial judiciary.
And the lasting impact of historical injustices.
Exactly. And I think this case, it really forces us to confront these uncomfortable truths and to ask ourselves some hard questions about what kind of world we want to live in.
Absolutely.
So we're going to leave you with a final thought to ponder as you continue to follow this story. How might the outcome of Nnamdi Kanu's case influence not only the future of Nigeria, but also broader conversations about self-determination and the balance of power between the state and its citizens on a global scale?
Right, because what happens in Nigeria doesn't stay in Nigeria. These are issues that resonate far beyond its borders.
And as we've seen with the debate around the term zoological republic, language has immense power to shape how we understand and respond to complex political realities.
So as we move forward, it's crucial that we engage in these conversations with nuance, with empathy, and with a willingness to listen to different perspectives.
Absolutely. Well said.
Okay.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
My pleasure.
And keep those thought-provoking articles coming.
We'll be here to break them down with you.
Until next time.
See ya!